Welcome back to 3D Dialogue. Our next guest returns to our show to help us continue our exploration of the connections between Western mysticism and Eastern religions. In a previous episode, we discussed the Eastern notion of self-cultivation and how we in the West might learn from this approach to spirituality. Today, based on some of the positive feedback we received from that last segment, we'll continue exploring these similarities and differences as we're once again joined by Professor Robert Carter, Professor Emeritus at Trent University. Thank you very much for joining us again.
Thank you for having me back.
Now, I think rather than ask you to define mysticism, why don't we take an opposite approach? Why don't we start by telling us what mysticism is not?
A good place to start, actually. Mysticism is one of the most misunderstood words and experiences imaginable. So let's do that. Mysticism is experience. It has nothing to do with hallucinations. It has nothing to do with the vague. It has nothing to do with the occult. It has nothing to do with faith. It has nothing to do with belief. It has nothing to do with magic. It has nothing to do with the indistinct. It is the most distinct and precise of all possible experiences. So think of the number of times you've heard mysticism simply referring to the vague or the indistinct. It's just the opposite of that. So that's a lot that we've just cleared away. What does that leave? Mysticism is the direct experience of the oneness of all things. One of my former professors told me that there were three kinds of experience. There's empirical experience, like when you see a house. There's rational experience, like when you see the truth of the Pythagorean theorem. And there's mystical experience. One who can't see a house is blind, doesn't have the apparatus necessary for empirical experience. One who does not understand the truth of the Pythagorean theorem is intellectually in difficulty. One who cannot see the oneness of all things is normal. I love that switch. So the normal person doesn't see the oneness of all things, but the mystic does. Now, what does it mean to see the oneness of all things?
Well, and actually, if I could just quickly interrupt, it strikes me, given that we're trying to do an East-West comparison, that the problem in the West is we always compartmentalize, we always specialize, we rarely even develop the capacity to see the wholeness. So without distracting you from what you were going to say, am I correct in seeing that as our fundamental disability, as it were?
And part of our educational system is to teach us to make distinctions. Now, that's not wrong. It's just not sufficient.
Right.
We are a dualistic society. We break everything up into, well, me and you and everything else in this studio and everything else in this world. Of course, Eastern people on the street do the same thing, but they have within their cultural tradition a long history of seeing things non-dualistically. That is, the oneness of things is seen. One of my favorite examples of this comes from Nishida Kitaro, a Japanese philosopher who died in 1945. He said, you must understand that seeing the oneness of all things is like seeing a kimono, a beautiful Japanese gown. You don't see the lining if the gown is well put together. But you know that it's lined because of the way it hangs. Just like a good suit or a good skirt is well hung, we say. So what is it that you see when you look through the kimono and imagine, intuit, that the lining is there? You see a beautifully formed garment that doesn't sag. You can tell the difference. So what happens when you look at a dewdrop? And instead of just seeing the dewdrop, you look at its lining. Its lining is the entire cosmos. You look into the dewdrop and you see the entire universe. You look in a grain of sand and you see the entire universe by the way it hangs, by the way it is in the world. Coming to see that this beauty, this transcendence is everywhere present is what I call the re-enchantment of the universe.
And yet I almost have to say that you and I could take for granted that we're here in the West and we're able to have really such a deep insight into this unity. But it wasn't always that way. Certainly, you know, we're standing on the shoulders of giants that others before us in the West have made efforts to try to reunite with that wholeness, to transcend that, as you say, duality of the Western mind. Maybe you could tell us a bit about Meister Eckhart, who was a Christian, I guess, theologian and philosopher,
and
who really helped make that bridge.
In the 13th century. Yeah, that's right. First of all, let me just make this preface. What is a minoritarian position in the West is, I think, a majoritarian position in the East. And that's one of the great differences.
Right.
So I can look at the great mystics of the West and say, hey, they're very Oriental in their approach. I can look at a few of the great philosophic thinkers and say the same in the West. But when I turn to the East, almost everybody is saying the same thing. Now, what are they saying? Well, Meister Eckhart is a perfect example. May I read you a passage?
Please do.
This is from one of his sermons. He was a very renowned preacher who, by the way, got into trouble, and many of the things that he said were considered heretical, and he was condemned, but was wise enough to die before they could do anything about it back in those days.
Perhaps because he was so ahead of his time.
So ahead of his time. Now he's seen as one of the greats in Christian mysticism. But listen to the beauty of this. It could have been said in the East. Some people think that they will see God as if he were standing there and they here. It is not so. God and I, we are one. I am converted into him in such a way that he makes me one being with himself, not a similar being. By the living God, it is true that there is no distinction. The eye by which I see God is the same as the eye by which God sees me. My eye and God's eye are one and the same, one in seeing, one in knowing, and one in loving.
Unfortunately, I'm going to have to take this opportunity to end this particular conversation, given that we've only teased our audience with really a surface exploration of this commonality. Granted, we will have you on again, but I think this has perhaps provided us with the first steps in really understanding that connection between a unifying mysticism, perhaps, of Eastern and Western practices.
And in both traditions, if you want to see ultimate reality, if you want to see, as we say in our language, God, you look within.
We all have the answers to that really perpetual puzzle that plagues the human condition.
Because we have that divine spark within us.
Well, thank you once again, Professor Carter.
My pleasure.
That was Robert Carter, Professor Emeritus at Trent University. Please stay tuned. You're watching 3D Dialogue. We'll be back with more right after this break.